Hello, good afternoon. My name is Lauren Pabst. I'm a senior program officer at the MacArthur Foundation in the Journalism and Media program. And it's my honor to introduce our next panel in my role as the newest board member of Media Impact Funders. Thank you. Thank you so much. The MacArthur Foundation has long funded both documentary film and journalism and their intersections. And they are parallel disciplines that sometimes intersect, sometimes diverge, are always complementary, and are always in conversation. Both require trust of the public and critically of the participants who chose to tell their stories. And in both documentary and journalism, discussions of ethics and accountability are live, active, and evolving. In this panel, we'll get a preview of a new survey by ITVS that sheds light on the state of ethical filmmaking practices, and we'll hear from the filmmakers of the new documentary, The Strike, about what these concepts mean on the ground in the making of their film. And actually tonight, one of the supporters of The Strike, the IDA, is hosting a screening in Oakland at the Grand Lake Theater, and tomorrow night at the Roxy, just up the block. And the film will also premiere February 3rd, 2025 on Independent Lens on your local public television station. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming filmmakers JoeBill Muñoz and Lucas Guilkey, and the president and CEO of ITVS, Carrie Lozano. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Media Impact Funders. Thank you, KQED, for having us here today. I'm really thrilled not only to be talking to this team, but to be talking about this study, which we think is the first ever study that actually hears from the people who participate in documentary films. So there's been a long conversation in the field. Actually, since documentary film began, there have been ethical conversations, but even in the last handful of years, we know that there's been a really vibrant conversation about consent, about ethical practices, even debates about whether or not participants should be paid, and what does that mean for the standards and practices and the ethics of journalism. And there have been many wonderful organizations who've taken this on, including DOG, the Documentary Accountability Working Group. But ITVS took a step back and said, what are filmmakers actually doing? How do we know what they're doing? And moreover, how do participants feel about their experiences of being in the films? So I'm so proud and so happy that we have a researcher on staff at ITVS. ITVS is the largest co-producer of independent documentary for public media. We also present the series Independent Lens. And of course, we're thrilled to have The Strike. So there's a number of findings. I'm gonna say that this study will be rolled out at Doc NYC officially and released to the public on November 19th. But we're gonna give you some highlights here and share some of our learnings. And it's occurred to me, I've been in a number of journalism conversations. That's also a part of my background is as an investigative reporter. And you know, a lot of what we found here within the documentary field is not just about documentary storytelling, it really is about journalism too. And what happens when sources go on the record, tell their stories, and the impacts that it might have on their lives, and how do we manage that, and how do we work with them? So without further ado, that's the teaser. I want to hear from the film team, and I'd love for you guys to set up The Strike, to just give us a sense of what the film is about, what its life journey and origin story have been, and then to set up the trailer for us.
Sure, yeah. My name is Lucas Guilkey. It's such a pleasure to be here and in conversation with you, Carrie. I'm one of two director-producers of The Strike. JoeBill and I have been creating The Strike for the last 5 years. It was conceived of over a decade ago. It's been a long, complex journey. It tells the story of the Pelican Bay hunger strikes against solitary confinement here in California, when people were being held for decades in isolation, launched a hunger strike that caught fire and spread to include 30,000 people across the state of California, across the state prison system, and really focusing on the individuals who lived that story.
So let's watch the trailer so you can see what we're talking about.
We have overcrowded prisons right now, but personally, I'm very pleased that we've got as many people in the state prison system as we do.
We decided to build these security housing units and isolate these people.
Let's build a true maximum security prison. Let's build one.
First thing you notice about Pelican Bay, it's so quiet. It's quiet. Being subjected to long-term sensory deprivation, I've been removed from nature and life.
I had resigned myself to death in a windowless concrete box. How do you fight that?
30,000 inmates spread across more than half of California's state prisons refuse to eat their breakfast.
Nowhere in the history of the United States had this ever taken place.
I had not seen my son in 17 years. Somebody had to do something.
If we build that, what are we gonna do?
CDCR is in some serious trouble here. They better address these issues.
Your whole body is just shutting down, shutting down.
I'm already dying inside of the shoe. So what you have to lose?
So this is an incredibly powerful film, and it involves a lot of participants over a long period of time. And you'll be happy to hear that in terms of our findings, over 90% of respondents on the participant side, and there were nearly 200 of them, felt like they would do it again. That they, regardless of what their experience had been, they did it with purpose, they did it for a reason, and despite the challenges or maybe some of the disappointments, they would do it again. That said, there was a significant number that also felt like they weren't prepared for what it meant to be in documentary production. So just the idea of cameras following them around in their daily lives, and the idea of retelling a story, oftentimes which might have been traumatic or challenging, they didn't feel like they understood what they were getting into. So I'm wondering if you can talk about the process of working with these individuals, some of whom were incarcerated when you met them, and then very vulnerable as they were released on parole and in other ways. Talk about how you talked to them about the documentary process and why you were doing it.
Yeah, great question. And I'll work on being succinct because, as I said, this is over a decades-long process. And so this is relationship building, communication, ebbs and flows. You know, at the beginning of the process, it was like, this deserves to be a documentary, but I don't know if this is going to be a documentary. And I was early in the process. I was actually an emerging filmmaker. You know, eventually we would go to grad school together. But beforehand, just building relationships with the DSLR camera, getting footage. And so to communicate, what is this going to be when I don't even know myself is tricky, but it evolves over time. It evolves over time. And I think what we learned is just like, it's all about the relationships and just being a human. And I like to consider myself a good human who has conversation, is reciprocal, caring. But, you know, it's also doing this work, we have to wear 1,000 hats at once, and sometimes we do get really stressed out. And so it's constantly reminding myself that the protagonists of the film are a high priority, and that relationship is a high priority throughout the whole process, before we know it's a film, when we know it's becoming a film, and then as the part we're navigating now, distribution, keeping that communication going, keeping that involvement going. You know, while we're under-resourced, to be honest. So it's a process.
Yeah, and I would just add too, I'm JoeBill Muñoz. Yeah, I mean, I think the essence of what Lucas is saying, or what I would add, is just communication throughout the entire process. And yeah, I mean, there were times, 5 years ago, if you would have asked us if we would have expected to be here in this room with these lights and to be playing tonight at Grand Lake and to eventually be on Independent Lens, we would have been, well, A, very excited. B, we wouldn't have probably believed you, but this was a journey, for us as well, like personally and professionally. But I think that, yeah, I mean, as Lucas said, it's just like kind of getting eye level with folks and just talking through where we're at and explaining, and then explaining again, and then if things weren't clear, explaining again, and just kind of doing that over the course of many years. That's not to say that, folks didn't, at the end of a long day, you're talking about, exhaustion and the sort of, what we're asking folks to do and what we're asking them to sort of share is obviously really intense. And so during those days of interviews, I mean, Jack, who appeared briefly in the film, or in the trailer here, the first time we interviewed him for 8 hours. And it's a story about, I mean, you could put the history of the California prison system next to his life, because he went through it. He spent 44 years incarcerated, 30 plus in solitary confinement. So, we had a lot to get through, as we would say in journalism, but we also just had a lot to hold and to handle and to think through and to share and to feel. And so, and at the same time, he'd just gotten out of prison for only for 2 years, and he was living with his mom in a 1-bedroom apartment. And so how do you navigate that physical space, let alone the emotional terrain? So yeah, I mean, I think it's just persistence and communication that I think is the key to relationships, period, which I think is kind of a new conversation maybe happening in the field, that these are relationships that we have with people. Yeah.
Well, I want to riff off that a little bit, because I think, I've spent my career straddling both and thinking about, as Lauren said, the intersections of documentary filmmaking and traditional journalism, the places where they diverge. And I think one of them is that notion of relationship. Because often journalists will say, this is not a relationship. You're a source, I'm a journalist, that goes against our ethical standards and practices. But talk about what it actually means to be in relationship with folks whose lives have really been subsumed by the criminal justice system.
Yeah, I was thinking about that in terms of the difference between journalism and documentary filmmaking. And a lot of it's just time. The fact that we're doing this for years and years, like, you have to be in a relationship. But I don't think you compromise your independence. You still stay fully independent, but you can have strong relationships. But, sorry, I'm just, I have so many thoughts about all of this. I'll also say, for a film like this, like, now that we're at the end, we know who the people featured in the film were. For a long time, we didn't know who would be featured. Like, we're talking to so many different people, and that gets complicated in terms of communicating how the ultimate film will be. Like, we don't know yet. We're not in post-production. And then there are just a lot of power imbalances in society, too, that we have to be aware of. And, there's legalized discrimination against people who are formerly incarcerated. So we need to be hyper aware of that dynamic in everything we do with folks who are formerly incarcerated. And also be aware of folks' safety. And so, like, in our film in particular, like, are people going to face retaliation for talking about some of these issues? I was in touch with folks while they were incarcerated, but we're not really documenting them at that time. We're just in touch. When people are released, then we can do the full sit-down interview. But it's like, are you off parole? Are you off probation? Like, are you going to face retaliation still? There's all of these questions we have to consider. And, interrogate our own blind spots that we might not know as well.
A lot of filmmakers, so we had nearly 700 filmmakers respond to the survey, which I think is one of the largest, studies that has ever existed, and not focused on a lot of the issues that often come up, sustainability, all the things that we know are really challenging, but really on this relationship. And so they talked a lot about feeling a lack of support to deal with these very issues. How do you deal with somebody's safety? If you're independent, and independent filmmakers, there's a reason we call them independent. They're essentially the equivalent of freelancers who are kind of doing this in very, very small shops, often solo for a number of years until they can build a team. And so they felt like they didn't maybe have the support to, if there was therapeutic support needed, if there were security issues, legal issues. Talk a little bit about, looking back, what might have been helpful to have in place to get through some of those questions, Lucas?
Yeah, this has been brought up before, and this is a worthwhile conversation about like therapy on sets for protagonists, which, you know, we could also use therapy.
Or healthcare.
I think everything we do is very trauma informed and very allowing the protagonist of the film to have control over the situation. In terms of, if we are sitting in a chair for 8 hours, like, do you want to stop? Like, do you want to start again tomorrow? Like, this kind of thing. Like, we honor how vulnerable you are being with us. And then, you know, we're talking a little bit about the distribution side, which is more new terrain, and preparing folks for the film becoming public. We're so excited to be on Independent Lens. And I could even foresee some type of mentorship or coaching. Again, you know, sometimes we could use that. But around folks who have, you know, bared their lives, bared their stories in film, we talk to them, you know, we prepare them for what it means to go public. But still, like, there are unforeseen things, like how are you using social media? What's your bio on your website? Like, you are reaching a new phase of being public. How do you want to utilize that moment even? So these are all worthwhile conversations to have.
If I just add going back to the idea of what it means to be an independent filmmaker, and to be, you know, it can be like an island at times, you know, that you're just kind of on this island making decisions, you know, these two brains trying to figure things out, making all these big micro and macro decisions. But, you know, I mean, I'll share this, and that's being recorded, but I think it's okay to share, that, you know, there was certain pressures at certain points. You know, these folks that we interviewed obviously had gone through a lot, and were at various stages of re-entering society. But, you know, I remember going back to in the early stages when we were pitching folks, when we were pitching funders about the film, and we were talking about some of the folks that we'd met, you know, kind of describing who they were, what they were about. And there were some folks who were not doing well, who were, you know, I mean, everyone in the film is dealing with with trauma in different variety of ways, but there were some folks who were not doing as well as others, right? And, you know, somebody had suggested that it would be, you know, basically, in short, oh, that person sounds like they're doing really bad. You should follow them and put a camera in front of them. And, you know, that, well, you know, obviously, ethically, personally, that's not what Lucas and I are about. But also, you know, just the thought occurred to me as you were saying, are you going to be there when we need legal help, when this person might face retaliation, when this person's going to need therapy? Or, like, are you going to provide those services when that person's going to need them? Yeah, I think the answer would have probably been no. So I just wanted to share that.
Well, and one of the findings on the side of the participants is that the hardest phase is actually distribution, that they felt like that all the communication kind of stopped there, that they weren't prepared for what it would mean for their lives to be put out into the public, that the filmmakers didn't adequately prepare them, that sometimes the filmmakers lost control, right? There are certain situations where your film gets acquired and you lose control of the conversation. You don't even know what's going to happen to the film. They weren't prepared for maybe some of the emotional toll. Like, some people felt like suddenly all these strangers are reaching out to them and saying, oh, that happened to me too. And they just didn't know how to support them. So there's what's beautiful about the survey is it is quantitative, but then there was also qualitative sections where people, we were talking about this yesterday, people wrote novels, filmmakers and participants, about their experiences. And all of these happened within the last few years. And so In terms of the distribution, and I think, JoeBill, you said you had 20 screenings this year, or this month, this month. And you're bringing participants tonight to the screenings. I was at one of your first ones in the Bay Area. It was incredibly emotional. Some folks were meeting each other for the first time. Talk a little bit about how you're shepherding them through this moment, and they will be seen by millions of people in February.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what we were saying kind of to start this conversation, it's communication and transparency. You know, at various levels, we might not know if somebody's writing an article that's gonna, you know, or there was a journalist at a screening and they want to write an article. Hey guys, there's gonna be an article written about this. We don't know what it's gonna be about. We're trying to figure it out. Just kind of being transparency and just communicating. But you know, when is the film gonna come out? When is this gonna happen? How can we prepare them for that? You know, dates change. There's always a back and forth there. Just kind of communicating and talking that part through. I will say, just in terms of how the field can support this, I feel like so the screenings that are happening in the Bay Area this week are being sponsored by the IDA, the International Documentary Association, and I just kind of have to shout them out because I feel like, and we're going through this together, and the folks there are awesome, but they are really, they're getting in there with this, right? Because look, in just full, you know, honestly, a lot of folks want to help out, and they come to a screening, they feel emotional, they see the impact that the film has, and they want to volunteer. But oftentimes, the people who have to do that mediation are us too, and we've got a lot on our plate, and things are happening. But what's been great about the model that IDA has kind of set up is that they're in there with us, and they're being really supportive. And so, yeah, I don't know if there's an opportunity ever to share what some of our takeaways have been from working in that collaboration. I'd love to, but yeah, you know, these festivals, yeah, we've been on the road constantly, and we've been taking some of the protagonists with us to some of these screenings, and they're being approached by people, strangers who are coming up to them and like, you know, and they act like they're best friends because they just saw their life story on screen. And so there's, you know, it's a lot for someone, for anyone to hold, for us to hold, but for someone who spent the majority of their lives incarcerated in isolation, it's a lot. And so, you know, I think at this point, if I can speak for them, I can't speak for everyone. You know, we know what to expect and how to handle things. But in the beginning, when we first premiered in Toronto, that was a lot. That was really intense for them. To be in a different country, to be, you know, at a film festival. I'd never been to a film festival. Yeah, I don't know if Lucas wants to add anything.
No, you said it is a lot emotionally, but there's also a flip side where it's also amazing emotionally.
Right.
And providing this platform. And I think we have an ethic too. It's like these are folks who have been silenced and erased by state violence for like the majority of their lives. How can we share the mic? How can we open up that platform? How can we bring them to as many screenings as possible? But again, staying in constant communication, because there's constant dynamics happening. Everything evolves week by week, and my phone line is open. We're always talking through things. But the film is about a collective that came together, and so we very much want to honor that collective and not make people feel disposable. Like this is their film as well.
Well, yes. So I would love. We have time for one quick question, and I know this is all a big tease, but we would love to hear from somebody from the audience.
Gosh, I'm speechless. Just the trailer alone. Oh my God. But my one question was goes to what you were saying about what as you're going through the process, you can't tell you've got people's lives in your hands, but in the process you can't tell them what the end result will be. And it just struck me. I wanted to find out: are there people who you followed who gave their lives, gave their story, their life story to you,
sure,
and who ended up on a cutting room floor? What happens in a documentary filmmaking when that happens?
Yeah, that's a really good conversation, or that's a really good question. I can take some of this. So, like Lucas was saying, this particular film is about a collective of incarcerated guys coming together to do a protest. So for us, it was like the more voices, the better. So there wasn't, when it came to folks who were incarcerated, no one was on the cutting room floor, as far as I can remember, that we interviewed, that we took the time to do that for. Some lawyers may have not made the film in the final edit, but forgive me. Yeah, right, exactly. So yeah.
There was a lot of filming over the years with various people that did not make it into the film, and that's really hard. It's a painful experience as a filmmaker, but it is very much a part of documentary filmmaking. That's just, yeah, that's part of it, because we have to tell a succinct, complex story in 90 minutes, and things have to fall by the wayside that are really important in real life and that are important in relationships. But that's, again, something we navigate in the distribution phase of the project.
One more? We have time for one more.
Thank you, Vince. I'm Jenna Lane. I work at Blue Shield, the California Foundation. And we recently put together a resource for journalists who work with domestic violence survivors, tackling a number of the issues that you've raised today. And I think, Carrie, you mentioned it in the introduction, or maybe the filmmakers can speak to where you landed on the question of compensation for the folks in your stories.
I'll set one thing up, which is one of the purposes of the study was to say, again, what are people doing? By and large, filmmakers are not compensating their sources, in part because there's no money, and I think people who participate understand that. I think the bigger finding is that when people participate in a documentary film, regardless of who they are, they could be a lawyer or they could be somebody who's telling their personal story, they don't do it for money. The vast, vast majority of them said that that was not their expectation, and that's not what motivated them to do it. It was a service, really, and it was cathartic for them to participate, and it was important for them. So that was an interesting finding, because we really felt like that was a big thing. But there are questions about, and this came up a lot, you'll see in the data, is it okay to pay for childcare or for a day of lost wages, or how about a meal, or how about some transportation, for archival materials, or if you are the unicorn who gets a giant windfall somewhere, which is less and less happening, even though it didn't happen all that much, to be honest, that became maybe an issue for folks where they're, wait a minute, you just sold that for $10 million, but that's a very, very rare occasion. So how did you grapple with that?
If I may, yeah. So the film's going to be on PBS, on public television, so there's certain rules and regulations that come with that. But I will say, what's interesting, I'm really excited to read this study, which is maybe the nerdiest thing I've ever said in my life.
I hear it's a page turner.
Yeah, it's a page turner. But yeah, to what you said about folks being excited, people want to know about windfall, and they want to know about money. And again, it's a conversation, and it's about transparency. But a lot of these guys, as Lucas was saying earlier too, they felt like their story hadn't been heard. Mm-hmm. And there's this one story it was actually at the San Rafael screening that you were at. One of the nephews of one of the guys in the film came up to me after the film and was like, my uncle had told me this story about what he went through and what it was like. He had just been out, his uncle had just been out for a couple years. But once he saw that kind of my eyes kind of glazed over when he started talking, he never really started telling me about it anymore. And but this film, now I understand. Now I understand what he went through. And I think for the guys, it was like they wanted someone to listen, and they wanted to share, and they wanted to go through year by year what happened. How, the many injustices that happen to one when one is in the carceral system. And I think that that was largely the primary motivation when two scrappy independent filmmakers come up to you and say, hey, do you want to be a part of this? If you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's a conversation happening in the industry that needs to keep happening. And there's a lot of dynamics at play, and it happens on a case-by-case basis. We have journalistic ethical guidelines, we have distribution guidelines, but then you also have conversations about, paying people for childcare, for missed work, or for their personal archive of home videos or photos, or like, is there a windfall on the back end, and should there be participation? And we're engaged in those conversations, and I hope that those conversations keep happening.
Well, I hope you all see the film. It's an incredible film because it's not just about the story of Pelican Bay, it's about the prison industrial complex, and it really breaks it down from a policy and capitalistic perspective. It's an incredible piece of work, so thank you for bringing it to public television. And I hope you read the study at ITVS.org, and thank you to the NEA and to the Ford Foundation for making it possible for us to do that work. It's not part of our legislative mandate to do this work, but we felt like we were in a position to take on these questions with some rigor that could help the field. So thank you so much.
Thank you. February 3rd.
February 3rd. But you can see it
friends.
tomorrow at the Roxy or tonight at Grand Lake.